Good morning. Good morning, everyone. My name is Vanessa Grellet. I'm an executive director at Consensus, where I run the Blockchain for Social Impact activity and the Blockchain for Social Impact Coalition. Today, I'm going to talk about some of the projects in the social impact space and give you some examples. But first, I want to answer maybe 2 or 3 questions. Why blockchain for social impact? What exactly is blockchain for social impact, and how do you affect change? So when Jerome asked me to talk about blockchain for social impact, I wanted to answer the question, why do we speak about blockchain for social impact? Is it something different than the impact that we have every day in our activity? Is it something different than just creating jobs through our the companies that we create, just affecting change through the blockchain? A few months ago, Vitalik posted a few tweets. When the crypto market hit 0.5 trillion, he asked a question that I asked to you guys: have we earned it? How much actual usage of micropayments is there in reality? How much censorship-resistant commerce to the common people have we enabled? How many unbanked people have we banked? And how many Venezuelans have we actually been protected from hyperinflation? So this is the question that I ask myself, and maybe you ask yourself. And his answer to all the questions was that we did take action, but maybe that it's not enough. There's a certain level, but maybe it's not enough. So I think what I want to open up to you is, what do we do about it? And before we start the conversation, I just want to lighten up the conversation about a few statistics on the world we live in. Not to depress everyone, but 2.7 billion people in the world live on less than 2.50 cents a dollar a day. 1 out of 7 people on the planet do not have an identity. 65 million people are displaced in the world. 1 in every 200 children is a refugee. 40 million people are victims of sex trafficking, forced labor, or forced marriage. 1 out of 7 people are malnourished. And malnutrition causes the death of children under 5, half of the deaths of children under 5 in the world. That's 3.7 million children every year. That's 3.7 million lives too many. Corruption is estimated to be 1.5 trillion each year. That's $1.5 trillion that's directed to assets that should be directed to productive programs, and that is allocated to corrupt programs. That's 2% of the global GDP. And 70% of people who own their land don't actually own their land or have uncertainty on the ownership of their lands. So given that, what should we do? Blockchain and what we do every day is super impactful. It's a radical innovation. It means that we're going to create a new manufacturing or processes to enable this innovation. It's competence destroying. It's going to render the current competence totally obsolete. It's an architectural innovation. It's going to create reorganization of businesses. The promise that I live for, and I hope that you guys live for, is that decentralization, peer-to-peer exchange of value, permissionless systems will allow to accelerate for settlement, lowering of costs of transaction, cutting out rent-taking middlemen, and lowering barriers to access to capital and information. That's what I came here into this industry for. But when we look at social impact and when we want to affect the people that I mentioned in the other slide, we have to think of the effect of what the technology brings. And as radical as this technology is, we have the choice to go to two routes, to do incremental change or to do radical systems change. If we do incremental change and do just enhancing efficiency and transparency of existing systems, we run the risk of using old frameworks and legacy systems. But we have the opportunity to affect the lives of people immediately. If we go through radical change, we allow for new business models to emerge. We allow the opportunity of leapfrogging legacy systems, but it might be a more difficult implementation for a wider scale, and sometimes requires the cooperation with actually the actors which you want to leapfrog. It might be stakeholders or governments. Some examples in the social impact of incremental changes are enhancing transparency in the donation systems, like what Alice is doing, measuring impact, adding layers of payment transparency, lowering fees, remittances. In radical change, thinking about identity, land titles, energy, if you really want to implement those systems at a very, very large scales, it's kind of hard. It's kind of hard in the developed world, it's kind of hard in the developing world. And Sandra Rowe, who is here, will be talking about this later. So if you want to get involved in social impact, and if you want to affect the lives of the people I mentioned in the previous slides, you got to know what you're getting yourself into, and you got to know what you want to do. And you got to know what type of change you want to bring into this world, and how you want to affect that change, and how you want to dedicate your time. Whether you're a technologist, whether you're an investor, whether you're a mentor, whether you're a business person, however you're involved in the blockchain and the social impact space, you really need to know and come in with your eyes wide open, because it's kind of harder than just building technology. Because intentionality matters. So as you'll see in the examples that I'm going to show, it's important that you know what you're going after. So if you really care about something, if you really care about the environment, if you really care about sex trafficking, if you really care about world hunger, and that's your goal, and you want to solve this issue, you know, create the new business and the solution that that solves for that. Understand the problems on the ground and work with the people on the ground. This is a human-centered design approach. This is not just about technology. This is working with people on the ground. There are so many constraints. People are so surprised working on these projects, how long it takes, what difficulties on the ground are just implementing those projects. Working with people on the ground, partnering with people who know what's going on, and just getting information from other people, lowering the cost of access to the technology, and collaborating with anyone that wants to work on the same projects is really key. And measuring your impact is really also important to continue to know what your goal is. You know, if your goal is decarbonization, measure as much as you can and as precisely as you can what you're going for. If your goal is alleviating poverty, measure how many families you've affected and try to be as precise as possible. The blockchain actually allows you to have enhanced tools for that. So now, what is blockchain for social impact? We created at Consensus and with other charities and NGOs something called the Blockchain for Social Impact Coalition. And we asked, when we created this coalition, you know, what are the main areas in which you guys are working on, and which areas, which sectors do you think are the key sectors which have the most impact in the social impact sectors? And 4 sectors came up. The first one was identity and vulnerable populations. Second one was financial inclusion. The fourth one was supply chain, and the fourth one, energy and environment. So identity and vulnerable population is really the cornerstone, I would say, of everything in blockchain, and especially in blockchain for social impact. As we've seen, there are so many 1 billion people, don't have identity in this world, and this is something that, governments don't acknowledge their existence. They don't have access to assets, to bank accounts. They don't have access to rights. So it's just living in another world. And so granting a sovereign identity to these populations allows them to really get access to education, property rights, bank accounts, etc. Financial inclusion also piggybacks back on identity, and there's a lot of application regarding remittances, crowdfunding, and I don't like to use the idea of banking the unbanked, but really the idea of creating new systems for the unbanked. Because why would the unbanked want to use the legacy systems which excluded them, right? Then we have the supply chain. So there's a lot of companies who are really looking deeply into the supply chain applications, especially to have a clear and transparent supply chain in order to track provenance and ethical production, and also with the hope that human trafficking and human rights abuses will be tracked on the supply chain or will be able to be avoided. It's going to be very hard to do it on the ground, and I'll go into the details of that later in my presentation. Then we have energy and environment with a lot of off-grid energy trading and peer-to-peer trading. After we identified these 4 areas, a lot of other areas, which I think are really exciting, popped up with a lot of projects. Those concerned more human rights activists, democracy, philanthropy, and equal justice. And I think those areas are really ripe for disruption. And I think maybe they're also a little bit my passion. So in terms of human rights activists, a lot of the projects are not public yet, but because of issues around security of some of the human rights activists themselves, but their needs are around security, their personal security, the security of the information that they carry, their freedom of speech, how they're going to, transmit the information in order to carry out their message, secure their funding when they're traveling, and secure their location. In terms of democracy, in the Western world, we have 200 years old democracies. In other areas of the world, we have other forms of government. I would say that none of them have been touched either by the internet, really, or the revolution of blockchain yet. And I think that's coming. I think right now we see applications around voting, around fake news, around movement building, liquid democracy, but it's not yet matured to really a deep, challenging, I would say, we haven't reached the moment where we're challenging the fundamentals of our democracies and our systems. So we're still in the incremental changes of what we're trying to do on the democracy side. We're trying to make the voting better. We're trying to make the representation better. But we're not challenging what representation is. In terms of philanthropy, there's increased transparency, donations in crypto. So here again, more an incremental change rather than systems change, because we're not rethinking about why we're giving how we're giving, but we're trying to give in a better way, which is perfectly fine in my view. Equal justice, that is also something that is a little bit untouched, but I think we'll see more of it. The criminal justice system in the US and in international justice system can be enhanced through the blockchain. Evidence-based and due process of law is ripe also for disruption, and I think those areas we will see more and more applications of. Any questions until now? No? All right, so I'll go quickly into the actual applications. And so a little disclaimer. I have a few examples. I'm not endorsing any examples. I think they're interesting examples. Some are not even on the Ethereum blockchain, but I think for the purpose of social impact, they're really interesting examples. I think some are still raising money. I'm not endorsing that either, but I think they're just really interesting use cases. So identity and vulnerable population. The first use case is Moldova and vulnerable population. Moldova has an issue with the trafficking of children, and they are trying to solve that issue because children are exported out of Moldova into brothels and turned into prostitutes outside of Moldova. And what they're trying to do is give these children a digital identity based on biometric data. And they're trying to combine it with an enhanced monitoring of the borders and an alert system for the missing children. So they're hoping that the children, once they cross the border with a digital identity based on the blockchain, won't be able to actually cross the border and be trafficked outside of Moldova. So we'll see how that project unfolds, but it's supported by the UN and a lot of other countries who really want to take action on the situation. Another interesting project is Blockchain for Change to connect the homeless. They partner with Life Wireless, who provided 3,000 telephones to people on the streets. And these telephones had an app who had 3 components: a digital ID called Change Pass, a smart wallet, and a marketplace. And this marketplace gave them access to all the rights that they actually already had access to, but really couldn't connect to. And you know, when you're homeless and you don't have your telephone, you don't have any connections, you know, you have all these rights, but you don't really, you know, go out for them. And the idea here is that you provide them with the identity, you provide them with the connectivity with the telephone, and they'll be able to exercise their rights. So it's still in, they're still trying to see how that works. But I thought it was interesting because one of the major challenge, of course, in all these projects is the connectivity, is the access to the smartphones, especially whether it's in developed countries or developing countries. It's really the connectivity which is an issue. So on the energy side, there's a lot going on, and some of the projects are not usually tagged impact, so it's harder to navigate. So you know, you really have to pick and choose what you think has an impact for you, or what you think is interesting. So we have Grid Plus, which is a peer-to-peer trading market for electricity. CarbonX, who's going to try to do carbon offsets for individuals. And then WePower, which I thought was interesting because it takes a different approach by allowing green energy developers to raise capital and selling future energy production upfront, and then create a transparent green energy accounting for distributed open ledger. And in that category, there's a lot of coalitions. The UN just created the UN Climate Change Coalition. There's the Climate Ledger Initiative, the Energy Web Foundation. There's a lot of interesting hackathons in that space, and a lot of solutions that are based on crypto economics and are trying to incentivize actors to take action and to find market-based solutions. So I think that's one area that's gonna be really developing in the future. The supply chain. So supply chain is something that that all the companies are tackling, not only for social impact, but a few examples here. Sustainable fisheries. People want to see the provenance of the fish and see how where the fish is coming from, that it's been sustainably fished. So that Viant is one of the consensus spokes that provides this provenance verification. We also have some solutions that provide the same thing for counterfeit pills. But the question is, how does the supply chain solution provide a radical solution for issues such as labor, slavery, and corruption? So in the garment industry, the minerals, usually, if you tag the mineral that you track, probably the slavery or the forced labor will come either before, just at the extraction point, and it's going to be very hard to see through the blockchain, and it's not going to show. Or there will be acts of corruption, or what happens if you're in a country with prevalence of conflict and the input is done under duress or under the act of corruption. It's going to be very hard. So yes, the supply chain is a great tool. It's going to be a hard tool to maneuver to actually guarantee, I would say, that there's no forced labor or there's no act of corruption in the supply chain. So I just want to be very careful with presenting the supply chain solution for blockchain as a silver bullet for these issues. I'll pass on this. Human rights and democracy. So we have, I have 4 examples. As you see, it's my favorite subject. We have Civil, which is sustainable journalism. It's a decentralized marketplace for sustainable journalism, where people are incentivized to vet creators, and there's a special governance structure for the journalists. Orchid, I don't know if everyone is familiar with Orchid, but it's really a surveillance-free access to the internet, where people can buy bandwidth and exchange bandwidth on a peer-to-peer transaction, so that you don't have to, you can't have access to the internet without having it being surveillanced upon you. Then we have organizations like Democracy Earth, who tried to create new governance tools and had an interesting experience with the Colombian peace treaty, whereby the expats who in Colombia were not allowed to vote on the peace treaty, and they set up a digital process to allow them to at least give their opinion on that. And so they were able to do a blockchain verification of their opinion. And so it wasn't a vote, but it had some value. and it had influence. And so we see these new movement buildings and these new forms of semi-democracy, which are interesting, I think. And Vote is a mobile election voting platform, and it just raised quite a lot of money, and it's designed really to make it easier for disenfranchised voters to participate. All these voting platforms and all these solutions have one purpose, is to change the system that is not working, and that is disempowering the less advantaged people in the system. And that's why, you know, we're all not sleeping at night, is because all the systems that are in place right now are creating so many inequalities that we have to find solutions to change that. On the financial inclusion, of course, I'll present a musical, unbanking the banked. And BitPesa. These two solutions have the potential to reduce the cost of transactions and remittances. So again, these are incremental changes and do not, I would say, address fundamentally the issues of financial inclusions, but I think there are good solutions. Financial inclusion is a hard nut to crack, and I struggle to give you a really good example in the financial inclusion where I found a very original business model that is completely different and thinks completely out of the box on how to reach the last mile, because all these solutions still addresses people who have certain access to certain either bank accounts or a certain civil society, and it doesn't reach the last mile. So time's up. Do you have any questions?
Just you presented a lot of things. Do you have anything concerning the equality between men and women?
I don't.
And do you have any idea of something that could go in this way on the blockchain that could help reduce the...
So I'll give you one statistic. So in the world of rural farming and agriculture, about 50 to 60% are actually women. And these are single shareholder farmers, which ultimately mean that if you give more money into their pockets, they end up having, they end up feeding their families, and then in turn, you've seen the statistics from Grameen Foundation and other institutions, which show that if you actually give women in those kind of agricultural rural regions more money, communities overall tend to do better. So that's one place where if you can make a direct impact in the which I'll be talking about in 2 minutes, then you can actually help lift the entire community.
Okay.
So I don't have an answer, but it's a great question, and we'll be thinking about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Just a question, do you have anything ongoing or collaboration about organ trafficking?
No, not in our...
Okay, so
no.
we will talk.
Hey, thanks for the comment that blockchain tech isn't necessarily a silver bullet and there's a much wider consideration needed for some of these issues. How much work do you actually do on the ground versus just building nice UI?
So we have We work with a lot of institutions on the ground, some of which we can't disclose, but most of the clients we work with are in developed countries. So we have we deal with direct issues on the ground.
Hi, thinking about this, I'm really interested about the identity thing, and I was talking today with a friend that she works for refugees crisis, and we were kind of wondering how are we gonna, like, it's really good thing to use identity to help refugees to keep their identity and to also to prevent, for example, the case of the kids in Moldova. But we were wondering how are we going to do to avoid governments to stop refugees moving around, like we see many countries in Europe now trying to avoid refugees coming here. So how do you think that it's possible to not turn this tool against the refugees?
Yeah, it's a risk, and it's a risk that we see also in Moldova. In terms of moving refugees, for example, in Europe, it would need a concerted effort for people to recognize a blockchain-based identity. What we're looking at is more sovereign based identity, and not working directly with governments, but working with NGOs. So, for example, if we work with the World Food Programme, it's working with the UN and their recognition of the refugees, and the way they recognize and they identify the